They bounced through the village in Merriman's big car, Jane and Captain Tom's in front, the boys behind, with a happy, fidgeting Rufus. All the windows were open, with no wind and the sun rising high already. It promised to be an uncommonly hot spring day. Simon said, "But he'll be there waiting for us. He's bound to be. That's why he ran away. Mary, how can we possibly just drive up in a car?" A note of frantic worry was rising in his voice. Will looked at him with sympathy, but said nothing. Merriman said at last, without turning his head, "The man in the dark will not trouble us again, Simon." Barney said, "Why not?" Simon said, "How do you know?" "He tried once more, once too often, to challenge the rights of the Greenwitch," Merriman said, swinging the car around a corner, "and the wild magic to which the Greenwitch belongs carried him away." He fell silent in the kind of silence that they knew meant an end of questioning. "Last night," said Simon. "Yes," Merriman said. Jane, glancing sideways at his eagle-bleak profile, wondered for a cold moment what exactly had happened to the painter of the dark, and then, remembering what she had seen, was glad that she did not know. And before they realized that they had gone so far, the big car was turning off the road onto a narrow side lane, roofed by low branching trees, past a notice that read Pentreath Farm. Simon said nervously, "Shouldn't we walk?" Willfully misunderstanding, Merriman waved one hand airily. "Oh, don't worry. This old bus has stood a lot worse bumps than this in her time." Simon tried to swallow his uneasiness. He stared out of the window at the green banks of grass and the thick swelling trees, at the lacy branches brushing the windows. Unconsciously, he clenched his hands together as they approached the last turn in the lane before they would see the painter's caravan, and at the last swing of the car, tightened his grip and fought the impulse to close his eyes. And squinting unhappily out at the green bush-scattered field, he saw that the caravan was not there. "Stop a moment," he said in a high, unfamiliar voice. Merriman stopped the car without question, and Simon tumbled out, with Barney close behind. Together they hurried to the spot where they both knew very well the glittering gypsy caravan had stood, where the horse had moved lazily cropping the grass, where the man of the dark had used Barney's mind of his own ends, for his own ends. There was no sign that anything or anyone had been there for months. Not a blade of grass was bent, not a branch flattened. Rufus, who had jumped out of the car after them, moved restlessly over the ground with his nose down, casting about in circles, finding no scent. Then he paused, lifted his head, shook it from side to side in a strange, undog-like manner, like someone with a ringing in his ears, and made off at a swift trot round the next corner in the road. "Rufus!" Simon shouted. "Rufus!" "Let him be," said Captain Tom's clearly from the car. "Come back here, and we shall follow him." On down the lane the big car purred, and then they were round the last corner and facing the farm. The low gray building seemed even more decrepit than Simon had remembered. He looked with more attention now at the beams of wood nailed cross-shaped over the front door, at the new growth of creeper reaching over the windows unhindered, at other windows here and there, black and broken like missing teeth. Long grass rose lush and new round rusting pieces of farm equipment left in the yard, a skeletal old plow, a harrow, remains of a tractor with its great tires gone. In the pen of a deserted pigsty, nettles grew tall and rank. Somewhere behind the farmhouse, Rufus barked shrilly, and a flurry of pigeons flapped into the air. There was a wet smell of growing things. Captain Tom said softly, "The wild is taking Pentreath Farm very fast." Merriman stood in the middle of the farmyard, looking about him, perplexed. The lines in his face seemed deeper carved than before. Captain Tom leaned against the car, gazing at the farm, one hand absently tracing its patterns in the damp earth with his stick. Will peered in through one of the front windows of the farm, straining to see through the murk. "I suppose we go inside," he said, without much conviction. "I don't think so," Simon said. He stood at Will's shoulder, and for once there was no tension between them, but only the studying of a common problem. "Somehow I'm sure the painter never went in there. It looked absolutely untouched last time. He seemed to just be living in the caravan on his own. He was a separate sort of man." Separate indeed, Merriman's deep voice came to them across the yard, a strange creature of the dark that they sent out as a thief only, to take the grail and hide it. It was a good moment to choose, for we were off our guard, thinking them too preoccupied with licking their wounds after a great defeat. But the creature of the dark was willing to betray his masters, having greater ideas. He knew the tale of the lost manuscript, and he thought that if he could secretly get that for himself as well, and thus complete one of the things of power, he could by a sort of blackmail make himself one of the great lords of the dark. Jane said, "But didn't they know what he was doing?" "They were not expecting him to overreach his commission," Merriman said. "They knew better, perhaps, than he did himself, how hopeless a fate lay waiting any lone figure who might venture on such a quest. We think they were not watching him, but simply waiting for his return. The dark is indeed preoccupied for a time," Captain Tom said. They have damage to repair for certain happenings midwinter last. They will make a little showing of themselves until the time of their next great rising. Simon said slowly, "Perhaps that's what the painter meant when he said to Barney, 'Am I observed?' Do you remember? I thought he was talking about you, but he must have meant his own masters." "Where is Barney?" Will said, looking around. "Barney! Hey, Barney!" An unintelligible shout came from somewhere beyond the far side of the farmhouse. "Oh, dear," said Jane. "Now what's he up to?" They ran in the direction of the shout, Merriman following more slowly with Captain Tom's. A great rambling tangle of weeds and nettles and brambles rose at the side of the old house and all around the outbuildings beyond. "Ow!" Barney howled from somewhere inside the thicket. "I'm stung!" "What on earth are you doing?" "Looking for Rufus." They heard a muffled barking. It seemed to come from the further of the two outbuildings, an old stone barn with a perilous half-fallen roof. "Ow!" Barney yelped again. "Mind the nettles. They're fierce. Rufus just goes on barking and doesn't come out. I think he must be stuck. He went this way." Captain Tom's limped forward. "Rufus!" he called, very loud and stern. "Here! Come here!" There was more muffled excitement barking from the ramshackle barn, ending in a snuffling whine. Captain Tom sighed and pulled his great beard. "Foolish beast," he said. "Stand clear a minute. Look out, Barney." Sweeping his heavy walking stick from side to side as if it were a scythe, he moved gradually forwards, thrashing a path through the nettles and undergrowth to the crumbling stone besides of the barn. Rufus's barking inside became more frenzied still. "Shut up, dog," called Barney at the captain's elbow now. "We're coming." He wriggled round to a rotting wooden door, hanging sideways from one hinge, and peered in through the V-shaped gap between door and wall. He must have got in here and knocked something over that blocked the gap. "I can get in here if I—" "Do be careful," said Jane. "Of course," said Barney. He squeezed in round the tilted door, pushing aside something that fell with a crumbling clatter and disappeared. There was a burst of joyful barking inside the barn, and then Rufus came leaping out through the gap, tongue lolling, tail waving. He pranced up to Captain Tom's. He was very dirty. Small damp pieces of rotten wood speckled his red coat, and cobwebs stuck sickly round his nose. Captain Tom's patted him absent-mindedly. He was looking at the barn with a faint, puzzled frown on his face. Then he glanced questioningly at Merriman. Following his gaze, Jane saw the same look in her great-uncle's eyes. What was the matter with him? Before she could ask, Barney's head poked out of the gap in the barn door. His hair was disheveled, and one cheek was smeared gray, but Jane's attention was caught only by the unsmiling blankness on his face. He looked as though he had a very bad shock. "Come out of there, Barney," Merriman said. "That roof's not safe." Barney said, "I'm just coming. But please, Mary, could Simon come in here just for a minute first? It's important." Merriman glanced from Captain Tom's to Will and back to Barney. His stern-lined face was tense. "All right, for a moment." Simon slipped past them to wriggle his way through the gap. Behind him, Will said diffidently, "Would you mind if I came too?" Jane winced, waiting for the inevitable snub, but Simon only said briefly, "Fine, come on." The two boys wriggled in after Barney. Simon flinched as a splintered edge scraped his arm. The gap was narrower than it looked. Scrambling to his feet, he stood coughing as Will came in after him. The dust was thick on the floor, and it was hard at first to see clearly in the half-light from dirty, overgrown windows. Blinking, Simon saw Barney beckoning him. "Over here, look!" He followed Barney to one end of the barn, clear of the piled timber and logs that filled much of the floor, and then he stopped. Before him, ghostly in the shadows of corner and roof, stood a gypsy caravan, of exactly the same shape and pattern as the one in which they had met the painter in the dark. There were the tall, outward-sloping sides, the insets of carved wood beneath the eaves of the overhanging wooden roof. There, at the far end, were the shafts for the horse, and at this end, the divided door, in two halves, swinging, like a stable door, reached by a wooden stairway ladder of 6 steps, and the top step was the step on which, at the end, they had stood. But of course it could not be the same. This caravan was not shiny neat, or newly painted. This caravan had dusty, worn sides in which only odd patches of ancient paint remained, flaking away. The caravan had one broken shaft, and the top half of its split door hung from the half a hinge. It was old and beaten, unused, unloved. The glass in its windows was long broken. It could not have been moved from its place for the many years since the roof of the old barn had begun to sag, for at the further end of the barn the roof beams lay rotted, with all the remaining weight resting on top of the caravan. It was a relic, an antique. Simon stared. It was as if he were meeting the great-great-grandfather of a boy he knew well, and finding that the old man had exactly the same face as the boy, but immensely, impossibly aged. He opened his mouth and looked at Barney, but could think of nothing to say. Barney said flatly, "It must have been here for years and years and years, since long before we were born." Will said, "How well do you remember the inside of the painter's caravan?" Simon and Barney both jumped at the sound of his voice, and they had forgotten he was there. Now they turned. Will stood near the door of the barn, half hidden in shadow, only his amiable blank face blinking at them in clear light. Barney said, "Fairly well. And you, Simon?" Will said, without leaving time for an answer. He went on, "Barney doesn't remember seeing the Grail at all, but you remember everything from the moment when he first took it out of the box it was in." "Yes," Simon said, with a vague, detached interest. He realized that for the first time he was listening to Will as though he were older, without resentment or argument. Will said nothing more. He crossed from behind them to the steps at the end of the old caravan, pushing aside with his toe the dust and debris that lay cluttered everywhere. He went up the steps. He took hold of the top loose hanging half of the caravan door, and it came away in his hands as the rust-eaten hinge crumbled into dust. Then he tugged sharply at the bottom half of the door, and it swung reluctantly towards him with the slow creak of an old farm gate. "Barney," he said, "do you mind going inside?" "Of course not," Barney said boldly, but his steps towards the caravan door were reluctant and slow. Simon said nothing to help him. He was looking at Will, whose voice, as once before, had a crispness and certainty that raised inexplicable echoes in his head. "Simon," Will said, "what did the painter say, word for word, when he first directed Barney to the place where he found the Grail?" Half closing his eyes, concentrating fiercely, Simon pushed his mind backwards and looked to see what was in it. "We were about halfway inside," he said. Like a sleepwalker, he went forwards up the rickety old steps, his hand on Barney's shoulder, gently propelling him, and with Will following, the two of them walked into the little room that made the inside of the van. And the man said, because Barney had said he was thirsty, "In that cupboard, by your right foot, you will find some cans of orange soda, and you might bring out a cardboard box you'll find in there too." So Barney did that. Barney turned his head and looked nervously at Will, and the Will who was somehow not quite Will, beamed encouragingly as if he were, after all, no more than an amiable, foolish-looking boy they had met at the beginning of this small, strange holiday. So Barney looked down at his right foot and saw beside it a low cupboard with no handle and the clutter of years mounted against its door. He crouched on his knees and cleared away the rubbish and scrabbled with his fingernails to find enough leverage to open the small door. When at last it swung open, he felt inside and brought out a battered, damp, evil-smelling cardboard box. He set it on the floor. All three of them stared at it in silence. Faintly from outside the barn they heard Jane's light voice cry anxiously, "Are you all right? Hey, do come on out." Will said softly, "Open it." Slowly, reluctantly, Barney took hold of the top of the box. The ancient rotting cardboard came away in his hand, and a brightness was in theirs, a golden radiance that seemed to fill the decrepit, crumbling remnants of what had once, a long time ago, been a caravan, and there, shining beneath their eyes, was the Grail. Chapter 13. In the farmyard, in front of the house, a great round piece of granite was set into the ground, an old mill wheel, worn and glass-fringed. On its bright, fleckled gray surface, they set the Grail and gathered round as Merriman took from his pocket the battered little cylinder that held the manuscript. He slid out the small roll of parchment, its edges cracked and flaking, and unrolled it to lie on the uneven stone. "And this is the second time for looking," he said. The children picked up stones from the grass and laid them gently on the edges to hold the parchment flat. Then instinctively they drew to one side, to let Merriman and Captain Toms study the Grail and manuscript together. Barney, next to Merriman, suddenly realized that Will was standing quiet and unmoving behind him. He ducked quickly aside. "Here," he said, "come on." The golden grail glittered in the sunlight. The engraving on its sides was clear and clean, but the smooth, beaten gold of the inside surface, as Simon had said, was blackened and dark. Will looked now at the close, delicate engraving for the first time in his life, seeing the panels filled with vivid scenes of men, running, fighting, crouching behind shields, tunic-clad, strangely helmeted men, brandishing swords and shields. The pictures woke deep memories inside him of things he had forgotten he had ever known. He looked closer at the words and letters interwoven between the figures, and at the last panel on the Grail, completely filled with words in this same cipher language that no living scholar had been able to understand, and like the other two old ones, he began methodically to look from the marks in the old manuscript to the marks in the Grail, and gradually the interweaving became clear. Will found himself breathing faster as the meaning of the inscription began to take shape in his mind. Staring at the manuscript, Merriman said slowly, painfully, as if he were spelling out a hard lesson. "On the day of the dead, when the year 2 dies, must the youngest open the oldest hills, Through the door of the birds where the breeze breaks, their fire shall fly from the raven boy, and the silver eyes that see the wind, and the light shall have the harp of gold. He stopped, his face tight with concentration. Not easy, he said to himself. The pattern is hard to keep. Captain Tom's leaned on his heavy stick, peering at another panel of the Grail. He said softly, his accent cradling the words, "By the pleasant lake the sleepers lie, on Cadaffin's way where the kestrels call. Through grim from the grey king shadows fall, yet singing the golden harp shall guide, to break their sleep and bid them ride." Will knelt down beside the granite slab and turned the Grail again. Slowly he read aloud. "When light from the lost land shall return, 6 sleepers shall ride, 6 signs shall burn, and where the midsummer tree grows tall, by Pendragon's sword, the dark shall fall." Merriman stood upright. "And the last line of all will be the spell," he said, looking hard at Will. The deepest dark eyes bored into his mind. "Remember, you meant your medad in conmectad. The mountains are singing, and the lady comes. Remember." He leaned down to the rock, moved aside the stone weights, and took up the small, curling manuscript in one big hand. As if the Druze did not exist at all, he looked down at Will and Captain Tom's. "You have it all?" he said. "Yes," said Will. "Safe remembered," Captain Tom said. In one sharp movement, Merriman clenched his fist, and the little roll of stiff, broken-edged parchment crumbled instantly into tiny fragments, small as gravel, light as dust. He opened his long fingers, swung his arm wide, and in a dusty shower the pieces flew away in every direction into oblivion. The children cried out sharply, "Gameri!" Jane stared at him appalled. "You've ruined the whole thing." "No," Merriman said, "but you can't understand what the Grail says without it. No one can." Simon's face was creased with perplexity. "It'll be just as much a mystery as it was before." "Not to us," Captain Tom said. He eased himself down to sit on the granite slab and took up the Grail, turning it in his fingers so that the sunlight glinted on the engraved sides. "We know, now, what is in the hidden message of the Grail. It will shape the next 12 months of our lives and help us to save men from great terror, very soon, for all time. And now that we have it in our minds, we shall never forget." "I've forgotten it already," Barney said plaintively. "Everything except a bit about a golden harp and a gray king." "How can you have a gray king?" "Of course you have forgotten it," Captain Tom says. "That was the intention." He smiled at Barney. "And we do not even need an enchantment to help you forget, as our friend from the dark did. We can rely on the mortality of your memory." "And you don't have to worry about whether anyone else will remember," Simon said slowly, understanding, "because no one else will ever hear or see." Jane said sadly, "It seems a pity that the poor Greenwitch's secret should be thrown away." "It has served its purpose," Merriman said. His deep voice rose a little, gained a hint of ceremony. "Its high purpose, for which it was made so very long ago. It has set us the next great step along the road to keep the dark from rising, and there is nothing more important than that quest." "That last bit you said from the Grail in the manuscript," Barney said, "what language was it in?" "Welsh," Merriman said. "Is the last part of the quest in Wales?" "Yes." "Are we going to be part of it?" Merriman said. Merriman said, "Wait and see." They lay in variously abandoned attitudes in the sunshine on the beach, recovering from an enormous picnic lunch. Simon and Barney were lazily tossing a ball to and fro without bothering to stand up. Bill Stanton was eyeing them in the nearby cricket bat with nostalgic optimism. "Just wait," he said to his sunbathing wife. "We'll show you just exactly how it's played in a little while." "Great," said Fran Stanton sleepily. Jane, lying on her back, blinking up at the blue sky, propped herself up on her elbows and looked out to sea. The sand was hot against her skin. It was a beautiful, sunny, breezeless Cornish day of a rare and special kind. "I'm just going for a little walk," she said to nobody in particular, and over the dry sand she went, across the long golden beach, towards the rocks that glistened with low tide, seaweed at the foot of Kamar Head. The headland reared up above her, grassy slope changing to jagged gray cliff. At the very tip the cliffs towered in a sheer wall against the sky. Jane's head was full of memories. She began to walk over the rocks, wincing a little as her bare feet, not yet toughened by summer, pressed against rough rock. Out here, last year, she and Barney and Simon had reached the peak of their adventure, the achieving of the Grail, that had lain for hundreds of years in a cave. The entrance covered totally by water at all but the lowest tides. Out here, they had fled from the pursuing dark, with the Grail and the little lead case they had found inside it. And out here, she thought as she reached the furthest point of the rocks with the waves breaking white at her feet. Just here, in the flurry of saving the Grail, the little lead case had plummeted into the waves and down to the bottom of the sea. And the Greenwitch had found it there, and made it a precious secret. Jane looked at the deep green water beyond the breaking waves. "Goodbye, Greenwitch," she said softly. She unclasped a small silver bracelet that she wore on her wrist, weighed it experimentally in her hand, and drew back her arm to throw it into the sea. A voice said gently behind her, "Don't do that." Jane gasped and nearly lost her balance. Swinging round, she saw Will Stanton. "Oh," she said, "you made me jump." "Sorry," Will said. He bounced his way forward to stand beside her. His bare feet looked very white against the dark seaweed patching the rocks. Jane looked at his pleasant round face, and then at the bracelet in her hand. "I know it sounds stupid," she said reluctantly, "but I wanted to give the Greenwitch another secret to keep, instead of the one we took. In my dream," she paused, embarrassed, but went gamely on, "in my dream I said, I will give you another secret." And the Greenwitch said, in that big, sad, booming voice, too late," and just disappeared. She was silent, gazing at the sea. "I only said, don't," Will said, "because I don't think your bracelet would really do. It's silver, isn't it? And the seawater would turn it all black and dirty looking." "Oh," Jane said, forlorn. Will shifted his footing on the wet rock and felt in his pocket. He said, glancing briefly at Jane and then away, "I knew you'd want to give the Greenwitch something. I wondered if this would do." Jane looked. Lying on Will's outstretched palm was the same small, green-patched lead case that had held the manuscript, the Greenwitch's first secret. Will took it and pulled off the cap, shaking out a small object into her hand. Jane saw a strip of yellow metal, gleaming, with some words engraved on it, very small. "Looks like gold," she said. "It is," said Will. "Low carat, but gold. Lasts forever, even down there." Jane read out, "Power from the Greenwitch, lost beneath the sea." "That's just a line from a poem," Will said. "Is it really?" "It's perfect." She ran her finger along the bright gold. "Where did you get it?" "I made it." "You made it?" Jane turned and stared at him with such astonishment that Will laughed. "My father's a jeweler. He's teaching me to engrave things. I go and help in his shop sometimes after school." "But you must have done this before you came down here, before you ever knew we were going to meet the Greenwitch," Jane said slowly. "How did you know what to make, what to write?" "Just a lucky chance, I suppose," Will said, and there was a polite finality in his tone that reminded Jane instantly of Merriman. It was the voice that forbade any questioning. "Oh," she said. Will put the small golden strip into the case and fitted the cap on tightly. Then he handed it to her. "Here's your secret, Greenwitch," Jane said. She flung it into the sea. The little case vanished into the waves, their foam curling round the weed-fringed rocks. In the sunlight, the water glittered like shattered glass. "Thank you, Will Stanton," Jane said. She paused, looking at him. "You aren't quite like the rest of us, are you?" "Not quite," said Will. Jane said, "I hope we shall see you again someday." Will said, "I'm pretty sure you will." Mr. and Mrs. Penhallow stood waving from the steps of the cottage as they left Merriman to put the 4 children on the London train, the Stantons on a visit to Truro for the day. "Goodbye. Good journey to you. Goodbye." The cars disappeared across the quay. Overhead, seagulls wheeled and cried. Professor did find what he came for this time, I do believe," Mr. Penhallow said, sucking pensively at his pipe. "That little gold cup from last year. That was stolen in London?" "Aye, but there was more, I fancy." Mrs. Penhallow gazed at the point where Merriman's car had rounded the corner with speculation in her eyes. "More of what?" "'Twas no accident he came down here at Greenwich time. He've never done that before. This was Captain Tom's first Greenwich making it home for a good many years, too. I don't know, Walter, I don't know, but something strange has been going on." "You're dreaming," Mr. Penhallow said indulgently. "That I'm not, but that young Jane was, one night. That same night everyone was dreaming, the night the whole village was hill-ridden. Such talk there was next morning of things best forgotten. And that morning I was right near the bedrooms going about my business when young Jane woke up, and she let out such a hoot, and was out of her room like a wild thing running to her brother's. So she'd been dreaming, sure," Mr. Penhallow said. "A bad un by the sound of it. What of that?" "'Twasn't her dreaming that stays with me." Mrs. Penhallow looked out at the quiet harbor and the drifting gulls. "'Twas her room. Clean as a pin it was the night before. She was a neat little maid. But everywhere in that room that morning there was a great mess of little twigs and leaves, hawthorn leaves and rowan, and everywhere a great smell of the sea." Here ends Greenwitch, 3rd book of the sequence named The Dark is Rising. The next book will be called The Great King. There will be 5 books.